So if you listen to how people talk about movies, whether in private conversation or in reviews and discussions online, what you'll notice is that most people seem to have this belief that movies need to be instantly and effortlessly enjoyable, and if they aren't able to enjoy them passively without putting in any extra effort, then those movies are just bad or not for them. Admittedly, for most of my life I shared that belief, but in recent times I started to think about it differently. At the time of making this video, it's the beginning of the year 2024, and in today's world, people are becoming more aware than ever before of just how much our psychology and the various mental processes passively running in our minds affect our experience of pretty much everything. So how are movies any different? The truth is, they aren't. Watching movies is an active process, and the only reason we may not experience it as such is because we are not aware of what our minds are doing when we watch. But by becoming aware of it and guiding it with intention, we can learn to enjoy so many more films than we otherwise would have, which not only would enable us to have a lot more fun at the cinema, but it even has the potential to enrich our lives as a whole. Admittedly, there are limits to what can be made enjoyable, but they aren't quite as strict as what you may think if you're used to consuming media on autopilot. I will address these limits later on in the video, but I'd first like to introduce the idea itself. The way to do this isn't some kind of magic trick or life hack. It's just a conscious application of mental exercises you might have come across before in other contexts, or maybe you're already using them in other areas of your life. I'm talking about things like mindfulness, perceptiveness, and flexible thinking. Consciously applying these things requires higher levels of alertness on your part, so if you're used to engaging with films rather passively, doing so may require some effort at first. However, the truth is, you're probably doing some version of this anyway, as your negative response to something you're watching is also a mental activity of sorts. The point is to take control of that activity, which would by default be completely or at least semi-automated, and reorient it to make the most out of your experience with the film rather than protest against it. Also, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that for some, all of this may seem way too elaborate and perhaps even a waste of time, in which case I would only say, fair enough. We all like to consume media differently and for different reasons. I personally was inspired to develop these ideas because I wanted to enjoy myself more, and to allow myself to appreciate the many aspects of filmmaking that I would often overlook by focusing too much on the wrong thing. After all, film is such a complex and impressive art form where so many elements have to successfully come together. You can always find imperfections no matter how hard the people making the movie worked on it, and whereas criticism can be constructive and useful, perhaps even interesting, I think it's a shame to overly fixate on the flaws of something that may have a lot more to offer, not least because you can always reflect back on the film more critically afterwards if that's important to you. I'm not saying that negative feedback or analysis is always bad, or that I never do it myself, only that it's perfectly possible to be critical in your analysis of a piece of entertainment retrospectively where it's necessary or appropriate, while also making an effort to have as much fun with it as possible while you're still watching it. This is something I practice all the time, and I can say that it works perfectly fine. In fact, it only gets easier. The only case I can think of where what I'm saying here doesn't apply to you is if you don't have any interest in enjoying yourself at all, and only care to approach the film as critically as possible all the way throughout. In which case, feel free to disregard this video essay. But for those of you still interested in hearing me out, let's get into it. So you probably don't need me to tell you that simply forcing yourself to think positively about a film isn't going to work. The intended positive relationship that you create with the film needs to come from an honest place. In other words, you need to approach it in good faith. You should want to enjoy it for what it is as opposed to what you'd prefer it to be. The first step is to be willing to understand and to make that concession. Every film has what I will call an identity. In other words, there is something that the film is, which can be further broken down into what it is trying to be and what it is successfully being. Starting with the former. When I say film is trying to be something, I am talking about the filmmaker's intentions for the film. For example, the filmmaker might be trying to make you laugh. They may be trying to make you feel or to shock you. They may not, for example, be trying to make you think. or it may be totally the other way around. The point is, all films are made differently and seek to entertain or affect you in different ways. If you want to have a positive experience with a given movie, you need to be open to that film's precise identity and realize that it is a waste of time wishing that the film be something that it isn't even attempting to be. So for example, if you're watching The Godfather and find yourself getting bored because the action just isn't exciting enough, then you're approaching it with the wrong mindset. You've created expectations that the film was never supposed to meet. Now that example might seem a little over the top because it's so clear for those of us who have seen the movie that epic John Wick-like action sequences aren't part of the identity of The Godfather, but I think it helps to illustrate my point. We tend to accept things like genre being an integral part of a film's identity, where with things like a movie's script we are generally unwilling to be so understanding. But the fact is, every part of the film, including the writing, good or bad, is part of the film's identity. If you realize that, you can make the conscious choice to let your critical guard down, at least temporarily, in places where it doesn't serve you, similarly to how you accept that there won't be horror scenes inside a romantic comedy. So it's not that you shouldn't have any critical muscles, it's that you can learn when to flex and when to relax them. Of course, there are differences between the nature of genre and the logic of a script, but the point is that both factor into the DNA of the film that you are watching. Also, sometimes you may miss a certain detail of the plot or make a logic error of your own and mistake that for a flaw in the script. I've noticed that a couple times when listening to certain film reviews by other people, and I've definitely made the mistake myself. Let me offer another example. You may identify with the main character of a film and then be really annoyed when they make a decision that you would never make in their place. It may take you out of the film because you might think something along the lines of, "That's ridiculous, why would they ever make such a stupid decision?" But what you're doing when you are thinking that is straining against the film. You are resisting the fact that the character is supposed to make that decision, because that's who they were written to be. Maybe it does make them stupid, or maybe there's something about their psychology or the situation they're in that you forgot to take into consideration. It's also perfectly possible that the writing for the character is just bad, but the point is you don't have to fixate on that. You can just as easily spend that mental capacity that you're using to rant to yourself about the film to come up with an excuse for the character's behavior, and when you train yourself to do that, you will often find that you can easily come up with perfectly reasonable explanations for why they may be doing what they're doing. In some cases, it might be enough to just give the character the benefit of the doubt, while in others you might have to really reach for an excuse or just make something up in your headcanon. And it is absolutely true that it is not the sign of great writing when you have to do that. But the more you get attached to the idea of how you would prefer the character in the movie to act, the more difficult it will be for you to relax and accept the story in the film for what it is. Now, it is important to emphasize here that I am not saying you are necessarily wrong to think that you know better than the director or the writers of a film. Perhaps your idea of what the character should do in that situation is better than the filmmakers. Whether for your own taste or for that of the wider audience, you may have a better idea of how to tell that story. But the point is that if you fixate on that rather than go with what the movie is giving you, you're making it more difficult for yourself to accept the film for what it is, and instead you're spending your time and focus on being frustrated about what it isn't. The idea of accepting what we cannot change is not somehow new or profound, but I am making the point that if we remember to apply that philosophy to all the small instances where we disagree with a film, we might find that even when we aren't riveted by what we are seeing, we can still make it a much less negative experience. Let's return to the idea of a movie's identity, though. Initially, I made a distinction between what a film is trying to be and what it is successfully being. This distinction is important because it can create false expectations in us when there is a mismatch with regards to these things. For example, if we're going to see a comedy that we understandably expect to be funny, then if it fails to make us laugh at all, our disappointment about this may distract us from the other elements in the film that may actually be enjoyable. Like perhaps the cinematography is pretty good, and taking the time to admire that rather than to cringe at how bad the humor is will inevitably lead to a more pleasant overall experience. It's also useful to be cognizant of how poorly executed elements of a film might directly obscure quality ones. Like we may think an actor's performance is lacking, when in fact the actor might be doing an excellent job at portraying a poorly conceptualized character. or even a perfectly fine character, but just one we don't personally like for one reason or another. It also might be worth considering, in the case of a character or performance we don't like, that we may not be understanding the character or their purpose or their psychology correctly, and this could be causing us to dislike them or something about them, and not necessarily the performance or the writing. So summing it up, the way we establish a positive relationship with a film is by identifying what it is successfully doing well, whether intentionally or not, and shifting our focus to those elements and away from areas where the film is lacking as far as we're concerned. If you are not used to consciously doing this, it may not work right away because it will be a new mentality that you are learning to adopt in place of your previously, perhaps even much less forgiving one. But with practice, it can become your default mentality when watching movies. Let's talk about the aforementioned limits to this approach now. There are always going to be cases where this may be especially difficult to apply. Most commonly, it might be difficult to enjoy a film that challenges our most deep-rooted biases or contradicts factual knowledge we may have. For example, it may be hard for somebody who practices real martial arts to enjoy a movie about fighting where the fighting is portrayed extremely unrealistically, or somebody with intimate knowledge of physics may dislike watching a movie set in a seemingly grounded reality but that doesn't respect the laws of physics. If you find yourself in a case like this, shifting your focus to less distracting aspects of the film might help, but where the immersion-shattering features of a film are prominent, it will be necessary for you to at least somewhat accept the world as it is portrayed by the film. It might help to think of films as thought experiments for the imagination. What if we did live in a parallel world that's almost identical, but say with alternative laws of physics? If you're able to entertain alternate realities like this, your biases or real-world knowledge might even work to your benefit. Like maybe the broken physics can be fun to observe for a change. Maybe it can even be funny. I'm not suggesting that this will always work, but it might be worth a shot, and you can certainly get better at it with time. Obviously, when you know something is definitely not for you, it's best to just avoid it entirely. And if you didn't know what to expect and just took a chance with seeing a particular film, just be ready to try and embrace the identity of that film as soon as it becomes clear to you. There will also be cases where the film just turns out to be very different from what you expected or hoped it would be. Then it becomes a matter of consciously realizing that that is indeed what happened, and rather than getting frustrated, try to pivot your expectations or mentality to match the actual identity of the film. There's something to be said here about films with intentionally misleading marketing, and it's not that they deserve your sympathy, which they don't. False advertising is a shitty thing to do to your audience and should be met with backlash. But if you find yourself tricked into seeing something you didn't expect to, well, you might as well try to pivot your expectations as best as you can while you're watching it, since you've already bought the ticket anyway. I would also like to mention one more category of film that may pose a greater challenge in particular, and that's movies with mixed or unusual identity, which may leave us feeling unsatisfied or confused. For example, we recently talked about the film In Bruges on this channel, where I brought up that the humor in the film felt wrong to me because of how melancholic and serious the contextual tone of the film was. This is a case where the film in question mixes two identities that don't necessarily go well together: absurd, over-the-top comedy and deep psychological drama. Although Eddie was able to get past this and enjoy it anyway, it made me hesitate to say that I like the film. Which helps to illustrate my final point, that although art can sometimes be uncomfortable, that doesn't mean it can't be a worthwhile experience. Previously, I had my hesitations about praising it in Bruges because I kept thinking of it as a piece of intended to be entertainment. However, what I realized when preparing to talk about it for our show is that the discomfort that it left me with was in fact very compelling. That it made me think and feel a lot of what I wasn't expecting and perhaps even thought it wasn't supposed to. But in retrospect, it made for an engaging experience that I will remember for a long time. And rather than being annoyed with it for its confusing tone that really messed with my head, I now think back to it with appreciation for showing me something compelling, interesting, and memorable, even if that's not what I was looking for when I first decided to watch the film. Hopefully this example serves to illustrate the greater point of this video, that we can learn to think a lot more flexibly and open-mindedly about the art and entertainment that we consume. We can learn to do this by default and in good faith if that is our honest goal, It's no different than unprogramming the unconscious behavioral and thought patterns that only serve to make our lives more miserable than necessary. I know that recreational outrage is popular these days, and a lot of people as well as content creators like to hate on things for fun or profit, or just because it's popular. And I'm not here to tell you that it's wrong to do so. As I mentioned before, we all consume entertainment differently and for different reasons, and if you'd prefer to tear things down for entertainment, who am I to tell you not to? I simply wanted to offer a different perspective. Because for me personally, learning to have this approach to consuming media was a very positive experience. Even more than with regards to film, because a lot of the qualities you develop when practicing this method, like mindfulness, flexibility, non-resistance, and the general willingness to approach things in good faith, will serve to make a lot of things in life easier, not just enjoying movies. Of course, that also goes for other forms of entertainment. There may be some differences, but a lot of the same stuff applies. It's just that I primarily discovered and practiced it with movies, so that's what I wanted to focus the video essay on. Also, this channel mainly is about movies anyway, so there's that as well. Finally, I would like to come back to the title of the video. Why almost all film? Sadly, although I think we can go pretty far with the mental tools at our disposal, to put it simply, some films are just completely incompatible with some viewers. Biases and preferences can often be overridden with a willingness to get past them. However, if a particular film only has the strengths that you were simply unable to appreciate while lacking in virtually every other area, then there may not be anything that you can do to enjoy it. For example, somebody who absolutely hates violence will probably never be able to enjoy an action movie that has very little to offer beyond gratuitous violence. Some movies may indeed be irredeemable or impossible to enjoy at all, but I would argue that you don't know until you try, as it very often comes back to our mindset or a system of beliefs we've built deep down that we unconsciously or stubbornly cling to even when they don't serve us for the better. I suspect you'd be surprised by what you can learn to enjoy or at least appreciate in some way. So all I'm saying is, give it a try and see for yourself.